This is the UX Ladder, Conversations Beyond Pixels, a deep dive into product cultures, inclusion, and the untold stories that shape experiences and trends. Am I pronouncing your name right?
You are, and most people just call me Nate.
Yep.
So Nathaniel is my formal name on my birth certificate. But Nate
All right.
is what most people refer to me by.
I have you down as Nate in my notes, but I figured I'd start with Nathaniel just as it's such a powerful name. But welcome. I appreciate you agreeing to have this conversation with me. I'm going to start by doing a little intro. So, for folks listening, meet Nate Dumas, a design anthropologist by his own description, who's as comfortable decoding cultural trends as he is navigating the quirks of food delivery apps. I do have my first question about that, so we'll get into that in a second. As a design anthropologist, you blend cultural insights with product innovation, which is really, really interesting. And the biggest reason, apart from the fact that I think you're amazing, that I want to talk to you is that you have such an interesting approach, and your background has so many different turns that I figured it would be really. I figured not only would it be super exciting to learn about your path, but also I'm super nosy and I wanted to learn. So currently, you're part of an in-house product team in the nonprofit political fintech space, where you translate human behavior into meaningful design solutions as well as product directions. Your product journey includes both big and small tech, but always with a focus on human-centered design, which, like I've been in the field for a while as well, and that really stuck out to me because it's not always easy to do, especially when big tech and small tech are so different, and then all the different spaces you've done are so unique as well. Your academic roots run deep. You earned your Ph.D. in anthropology from UC Berkeley. You've also served as a lecturer and research associate at UC Santa Cruz's Department of Anthropology. And there, working with students, you guide them to the nuances of language, culture, and society, which I'm sure it's left such a lasting impact on the academic community. But I'm really interested to dig in just a minute about how this has also influenced your work. Beyond your professional academic pursuits, my online sleuthing, and also just learning, I've discovered that you are a passionate advocate for diversity and inclusion in tech. You are also an active participant in events that promote varied perspective to drive meaningful innovation, which is I do think this is true for folks who go down your path, but especially for people who come from underrepresented groups, because your perspective is unique literally just by inheritance as well as by lived experience. I've also discovered the multi-layered Nate is a health and fitness enthusiast, and I was really interested in some of the tunnels I was going down about the stuff that you were sharing on platforms like Medium. Overall, though, in every conversation, I was so delighted to find that you had this really amazing blend of intellectual curiosity and cultural awareness, which I found in everything from your hey, food delivery app, FU, all the way to the stuff you write about health and fitness, because you're very passionate and you bring that intellectual mindset to you're sort of analyzing and coming from that research mindset. So welcome, welcome, welcome. It is such an honor. Thank you for making time on a Friday. My first question for you is, as I was doing all my sleuthing and learning about the wonderful Nate, what is with you and food delivery apps? You seem to be looking at each of them and then calling them out for all the things that don't work. Agreed with them, all 100%, but you're really good at giving them feedback as well. And it's like the politest mad tweets that I've ever found. Tell me about these experiences.
You must have found my tweets somewhere online that I used to do this about. Because one of the things that I used to do is I did that because what I realized is that if you send people this stuff through their regular, help desk, the tickets can get lost. But I was like, people pay attention to what people say about them online. And so that's why I put those things there. And I also did it because one of the things that I feel is that, I don't know about everybody else, but food is really important to me. And the fact that the delivery price is so high one of the
Yeah.
things that I feel is that it is not always a user-centric experience, even though, I'm an anthropologist. And so we talk about, there's actually a field called the anthropology of food. And so,
Mm,
we think a lot about those things. And I just felt it was
yeah.
important to, sort of blend those two fields of me in the UXR space and also me as a consumer, because I think that when you are in this
Yeah.
space and in both worlds, you do give a different perspective on it, so that I just like people
100%.
to feel like I'm not just complaining about things to complain, but there's a
Yeah.
reason why I want that feedback to be taken into account in that way. So what I hope I
Yeah.
was doing with those tweets, well, they were sometimes it's amazing what you forget is on is on the internet about you. What I hope I was doing is actually speaking. I don't want to say for, but speaking with other, consumers about
Hmm.
the same issues, and it would give them a chance if they had those issues to sort of do
Yeah.
+1 or tag me into this or this, and so it would actually help to make the pain point more visible for places when usually. You get a help desk ticket, and I kind of have this thing in my mind where I think that some people are just like, oh, yeah, well, we thank you for your notes and everything. And then they just go off and order something, on Amazon and forget all about you. And so
Yeah.
I like to think of it as it's another way of giving feedback. And I
Mhm.
will say that I also did that because at other tech companies that I worked at, we used to actually, this was part of the share outs for the customer service group, I think. They would actually have to report out on the tweets and other things on social that
Oh, nice.
found. And so that was an important part of it. So I knew that if we were doing that when I was at that job, other places might be doing it too. And so that's why I kind
Nice.
of did that. I used the knowledge from the inside to work
Ah. I
outside.
think the your notes also really stood out to me because just as someone who has run a food delivery service, usually the tweets are so angry or like just plain mean. And yes, we messed up and all of that, but don't gotta be mean, man. Because like we also lose your point. I just found all of your notes so helpful that um, coming from that perspective of food delivery, I was like, oh, I wish people had talked to me this way. Then I'd know what the actual problem was. All right. I'm going to shift us a little bit to learn more about you and sort of where you come from and all of that. So, if I might start with, how would you describe your personal identity? And has your family or upbringing played a role in shaping that identity or how you move through the world as a human?
Okay. I'm going to show you something real quick. And for all those out there who cannot see, I'm going to describe what I'll show you. And I keep this on my desk. This is a picture of me and my dad. Let me actually, yeah, there it is.
Oh,
And I keep this with me on my desk all the time
yeah.
as an answer to your question. Because I
Okay.
kind of think of it as that we're side by side. And I was like, his brain lives in my brain in that sense. And so to answer your question, it's like, oh, how do I explain it? Basically, I'll go into a brief thing about my dad. My dad was in law enforcement. He retired from that. But I like to say that my dad turned me into an anthropologist because we're from a really small town in the South, in Florida. And my dad's involvement in law enforcement, I got to have a childhood that I think other kids didn't get to have because my dad would tell me all these stories about, so when he was a cop first, the life on the streets and everything else around
Yeah.
that. And so I got to sort of ask him questions about these things. And I'd be like, well, why do people do this? Why do they think about it in this way? What's the culture like? So I kind of say that he trained me to be an anthropologist at a really, really
Wow.
young age. And the other thing that he really taught me around that, and I told him this a couple of months ago actually, is that while most people would look at people who commit crimes in a really flat way around like, oh, well, they must be this or this or this, and true crime shows don't help at all in this process, I think now. My dad
Yeah.
really got me to see the whole person and the whole process. And it was really important when I became, an anthropologist because I took what he taught me then around going beyond just the superficial demographics and to always think about why and to approach it from a non-judgmental perspective. And those are the things that I carry with me in my, career to this day, where I kind of say that a great, UXR and anthropologist, because that's what we're also trained to do as well,
Yeah.
can really hang out with almost anybody, and really is able to understand, or to try to get to know them as a person or as a group, and to suspend your own judgment around the way that one thinks one should be. And my father, I always go back to him because my father has never committed a crime in his life, but he was able to understand people who have, in that sense. And so my father taught me basically anthropology, or how we do, ethnographic like observations as a participant. But you can be in that space, but also be distant from that space too. And
Mm.
so that was a huge part. And I'll just say one other last thing: being from a small town, that actually it's interesting because in a lot of ways, when you live in a small town, you have to be approachable, even though you may not want to be approached. It's one of those things about growing up in the South as a Black man, and so in a small town, I ought to say. And so that's actually one way that I've also used this in the field too. Is that when people are like, "You're so approachable with any kind of participant," I'm like, "Well, because when you come from a small town, you kind of have to get used to the fact that you have to get to know people, and you cannot get out of a checkout line with just a hi and a bye." And so you really come to value relationships and trust. And those are the things that I think make a really good person for the UXR field, in anthropology especially,
Yeah.
but UXR especially. So I say that those are the things that really, did that. I'll just throw in one other thing too. My father
Yeah.
is probably one of the most analytical people I've ever met. Uh,
Huh.
And one of the things that he really taught me, we would go back and forth
Hmm.
about a variety of topics. And one of my favorite
Yeah.
things that he does is, and every time he does this, and he still does this, and I just get so excited when I see him do it, is he'll get real quiet. And then he'll go, I was thinking about something. And then he'll go off on this thing. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And I bring that up because that's the approach that I bring to research as well, where I find that the insights are not coming from my brain. What they come
Hmm.
from is interaction with everybody on that team and the participants too, but really everybody on that team as well. And so for me, I don't take the approach that some people do where they're like, it's all in your brain. I really
Yeah.
find that the insights come out from dialogue with everybody and using different perspectives to get the
Yeah.
insights out. But I got to say, all that came from the way that I was raised.
Yeah. It sounds like you had the kind of upbringing that has you sort of pause and reflect and turn things over the way an anthropologist or a researcher would.
Mhm.
And the fact that your dad was in law enforcement and came at it as this, because it's so easy to say a person is, I have little kids, and right now my 4-year-old is starting to explore the world of superheroes. Like, is this the bad guy? Is this the good guy? And it's so easy to
Mhm.
divide the world like that. But the ability to, especially being in law enforcement, to sort of turn it and say, no one is like bad. You know what I mean? I think that's super interesting because it's that perspective. Like, where do you come from? What do you do? And that's the work of the researcher, right? Like, you think about everything around someone and say, okay, you are reacting in X way because of this lived experience. Well,
Mhm.
thank you for sharing that. I appreciate learning a little bit more about your dad as well. But speaking of your family and sort of your upbringing as this, like, very in this very anthropological way, as well as a curiosity mindset. Um, do you feel that the journey from anthropology and research was just very natural, like it just made sense? And then how did you end up, because you've spent time in academia, which you clearly, you and I talked about before about how you really enjoyed that as well. How are you finding the journey into the product world from academia as well? Like, how's that been?
Okay, I got to actually make a detour because there was another detour before anthropology. If you
Mm-hmm.
probably looked at my LinkedIn, I don't know if I
Mm-hmm.
bring this up too much anymore. I went to film school actually, and
Tell
so I
me.
was a filmmaker for
Mm-hmm.
a bit, and then I discovered the anthropology bug around the same time. And so, really, I like to think of myself as I was a storyteller. I still am because I think that research is storytelling.
100%.
And so then it was about learning the aesthetics of storytelling. Anthropology was a really nice fit for that because it was about the story of people during a certain time period. And language was always an interesting thing for me because as a linguistic anthropologist, like that's what I'm trained in. I've always found I grew up, in the South where language is political in many cases. I knew from a young age that the way that my kin people spoke was actually very different from the way that I was being taught to speak in school.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to constantly float in between many different worlds. And it related to film because, in many ways, film is one of the main places where we learn ideas around how to speak, who to speak a certain way with, and everything else. And so all of those things kind of gel together when I became a linguistic anthropologist. Uh,
So
yeah,
I'm going to pause just 1 second to
yeah,
say, tell me more. What is linguistic anthropology for,
that's a great
because
question.
like, right?
Yeah.
Because I'd love for you to break it down
Yeah.
because it's even new to me. And I was introduced to it, frankly, through you.
It's a great field. So, real quick TLDR. So, anthropology has four subfields. There's cultural. So there's cultural, biological, slash physical, linguistic, and archaeological.
Okay.
And so it used to be back in the day, you were trained in all four fields, and there were no specialists. You were an anthropologist. That changed. I want to say probably in the '60s or the '70s. Really, we saw it happening more in the '80s. And so then you would see people now saying, "I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm a biological anthropologist," and so around that. But before, there was a time where we were all just anthropologists before the rise
Right.
of specialization. So linguistic anthropology, we are trained in both linguistics and anthropology, and our idea is to look at the interface of language, culture, and society. Or one of my favorite definitions out there is we look at grammar as a cultural resource and interaction as a cultural practice, and to understand the ways that language and culture mutually shape people, processes, and institutions. So to be really funny about this, we love to sit around and listen to hear people talk, and we also like to sit around and read what they write.
Yeah.
And we spend hours doing this. And what we're often
Yeah.
doing is looking for the cultural ideologies or like understandings that people that they reproduce or they make through how they interact. So we are known for doing all sorts of fun things. Like we look at how people talk within, in certain spaces. And so we'll actually draw out maps around like, hey, during this time, people were sitting or they stood here, 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 and we mark gestures and everything else because we really do believe that so much of cultural and social life is actually built through language and interaction. So we study both.
Yeah.
So like we look at both the formal properties of language, and that's why we're
Okay.
trained in the field of linguistics, and we also look at things like conversational properties, which sociologists have actually been very good at showing us with turn taking and all of those things. And so I always found that to be quite an interesting thing because so much of the UXR field relies on language and interaction because that's how
Yeah.
we get the data that we get. And yet there's not a lot of linguistic anthropologists in the UXR field. So I've
Yeah.
found that this has resulted in a lot of us not being quite as, how do I phrase this? We're not quite as reflexive or reflective about language use in the
Mm.
XR field and interaction as a result of it. Or when we are, it tends to be very
Yeah.
like it tends to be very prescriptive, like no bias or or don't lead in
Sure.
questions. And I always joke, interaction builds off each other, so you always lead somebody to something. So
Yeah,
it's
that's fair.
funny how for the field to most of our data is linguistic in
Yeah.
in the UXR space, but I have yet to see a critique of the UXR methods through a linguistic I like through a
Yeah.
linguistic I like anthropology lens, which one day I'll
That's
write.
so interesting, right? Because as you're talking, what's immediately coming up for me is code switching, right?
Mhm,
Like, so for instance, just reflecting personally, I obviously have an accent. At this point, I've lived more of my life in America than in Pakistan, where I was born and raised. But now I have American kids. And my 4-year-old, I noticed recently that she pronounces her name differently depending on if I'm around
mhm,
and depending on who she's talking to.
mhm,
Um, and so it's just like that idea of code switching or like just what certain phrases mean to certain cultures. That's what's
mhm,
coming up for me. Um, Talk to me about this because what I really want to know also is that, in all of this work and this lens you're bringing, which you're right, it is very unique, right? Because usually what we'll do as researchers will, and even as designers who work very closely with researchers or product managers, will download the work and you're right, it's qualitative, right? It's so open to, first of all, who's reading it and in what mindset, but like
mhm.
words matter. um so two questions are coming up for me. That said, it's like, how do you decode all of this? And then two, when you're trying to sort of build a space where you want folks to know, hey, come as you are, right? Like,
Mhm.
speak with the cultural context you have. You don't have to code switch. How do you get there? Can you get there as a researcher if you're trying to like, it's like lots of times people are afraid to get on camera, or even if they're off camera,
Mhm.
they don't want to sound dumb, or they don't want to speak out of turn or be recorded. And especially in the space you are right now, you know,
Mhm.
political fintech, you deal with money and politics, and that's even hard. It's a high stress use case. So yeah, all of that is to say, how do you manage to get people to not code switch, and how do you get people to sort of be comfortable in who they are so that they speak
Mhm.
as who they are?
That's a great question. And I think it is one thing that anthropologists love to do overall, too. Because the last thing that we want is for people, although this still happens, and we write about this too, that
Yeah.
people do, pretend at first. That's why we spend a year in the field if you're doing formal academic work, because of the fact that, we used to make a joke that, like, everything that you see in the field the first 6 months is usually a lie. The next 6 months is actually when things begin to come out, because at that point, people have gotten used to you at that point. Now, in industry or in the non-academic space, I got to make that process go faster. And so that's a really good point around informal research. I have a year to make this happen. Some of us spend
Hmm.
2 years in the field, if not more. I got to do this within an hour. And so
Yeah.
one of the things that I do is, for me, it starts, and there's actually a way that I do the consent process, that I don't think that everybody. I've talked to other researchers about this, and they don't do it in this way, but I do it this way because it comes from my background in anthropology, and also I will say it comes from my background as a native anthropologist. That's another term that
Hmm.
so that we have. So what that term means is it's anthropologists who traditionally used to be the subjects of study, who are now the ones who are doing the inquiring on the other side. So
Hmm.
it was very common to study Black folks in the U.S. In anthropology. So
Right.
and people in sociology did this too, but it was not common for us to be on the other side. So we actually had very different thoughts. And one of my mentors, when I first got into the field, wrote about this. We had very different thoughts about the way that the consent process ought to work and everything else, because we knew that a lot of those had come from, dare I say, Eurocentric notions around who a person is,
Mhm.
what consent is, and everything else. And so I actually still take that into account when I'm doing this process with my, participants now, where one thing that I always do is I never start the camera first. whenever they first, I mean, put it this way, I never start the recording and streaming to the, to the observers first, because I need to work out a relationship with them during that time and to get us both comfortable, because it's kind of like they're meeting me for the first time. I'm meeting them for the first time on
Yeah.
camera. I acknowledge that. I'm like, hey, this is not something that people do all the time. And so there's that. And then I actually walk them through what is in the consent form that they signed. For me,
Oh,
that's really
interesting.
important because I want them to know what they signed, and to
Hmm.
also let them know that for me, consent is ongoing. Other researchers from different, traditions don't entirely believe that. As
Yeah.
a Black person who has been studied to death, I like to say, in this country, we know how important,
Yeah.
consent can actually be. And also, we respect the fact that consent is ongoing and it can be taken away at any time. And we respect
Yeah.
that because we know that there were times where you think you know what the research endeavor is, and then you get into it, and then you're like, no, I don't want to do this anymore. And so
Mm.
I respect that with them and let them know, hey, I'm not
Yeah.
after any specific thing, and I encourage them to treat this more as a conversation more than anything else.
Yeah.
And I also, depending on, so one of my colleagues in sociolinguistics, he wrote about this and he called it ethnosensitivity.
Okay.
Basically, what it refers to, it's the code switching thing around for
Yeah.
people that you know that you can code switch with, you do it and see how they feel about it. But there may be people that you cannot code switch with, and if you try to do it, it can be taken as offensive. And so, depending
Mm.
on the participants, when I see the level of formality or informality that they're going with, I try to match that, because what I often
Oh,
tell
interesting.
people is that it's not, I know it's, and this is why I say that anthropology is one of the more like humanistic of the social science, more like, sciences, because a lot of UXR really came from a psychological cognitive science background where it sort of
Yeah.
treats people like they're in a lab setting. As an anthropologist, I like to say that some of us are in the lab, but a lot but a lot of us are not. We're in the field, so we can't
Yeah.
really manipulate things in the same way. And
For sure.
so I take that field mentality, I want to say, into the quote unquote lab, and I'm like,
Yeah.
be who you are. Another thing that I often will tell folks to get them comfortable. Again, I always tell them I'm not looking for anything in specific, and I always tell them I may ask you things that you don't want to talk about. That's fine. Just say, Nate, I don't want to talk about that. And when I tell them that, I usually get the response of, oh, there's nothing, that I don't really care to share. But they will often say,
Yeah.
thank you for giving me that out. Because, and then I will also tell them too, you never know what's going to come up in a session. This comes from
Yeah.
like from anthropology, where there are many of us who actually talk about things that we did not publish, and it's not because we were trying to hide anything. One of the things that is in our code of ethics is do no harm, and
Yeah.
we really take that to heart around, if talking about this thing could actually put any of our participants in harm's way,
Hmm.
we actually have to really weigh that and think about, while it might, even with pseudonyms. So there's,
Yeah.
and I'll say the last thing that I do with them is the pseudonym trick, where I always tell them, okay, you get to pick a name that you want to be known by. I'm not going
Mm.
to use that name during this interview setting, but it'll be used in further workouts, outside of that. So that lets them know that
Yeah.
I'm doing everything that I possibly can to make sure that it is not traced back to them.
Yeah.
By letting them pick a name, it's one of those things that comes, from anthropology as well. It gives them, we treat people now as co-participants in the process, as opposed to, I'm going to extract something from your brain. And so
Right.
when they do the pseudonym trick, they have a lot of fun with that. I tell them, pick a name that you want to be known by, and they have a lot of fun around it,
Yeah.
And so it gives them that freedom to step into, I'm speaking as me, but I
Yeah.
also like don't have to fear that like someone who may look at this transcript will know exactly who this person is.
I love that. Okay, so many thoughts right now,
Great.
but like, oh my God, you said that there's so many nuggets in there. But the first thing I want to go back to is that you said some, I mean, you said many interesting things. But the first thing that I want to dig into a little bit more is that in this work that you do to get people comfortable enough to get, because you're building trust there, right? And you're doing it on an ongoing basis. Just working in tech, and like you, I've done big and small and the startup thing and all the things. And I have often come across a lot of folks who will argue that whenever you sit down in a research session, you should always just have recording on because you don't even have to deal with it. Obviously, the lawyers of every company will say, no, 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 behave yourself. You have to get consent. It's
Mhm.
also the law, right? That said, it's technically you can have the record button on, but I really appreciate what you were saying about I always ask people first and I sort of
Mhm.
give them the highlights of consent because it's so important. Do you feel that your personal identity as a person of color, um, that is a big influence in that? Because a lot of times, to be blunt, when I have this argument, because I'm with you, I think you should
Mhm.
always say, like, hey, okay, if I hit record, like even in this session, I wanted to give you a heads up because I think it's like, also puts the other person at ease, right? So
Mhm.
there's like a thing that you're doing that goes beyond like one to make them comfortable but also to
Mhm.
build trust. So my spiel is just to say that most of the times when I have this argument, it's generally with white people. And do you feel that people of color are sometimes more mindful? And I think that's what you were sort of getting at, is that we're more mindful because of lived experience. And obviously you and I have different experiences. You've also lived in this country very
Yeah.
differently who I have, obviously. But so one, as a person of color, do you think that influences that decision? One, but then two, it's also the better way to make people feel comfortable and open up more. So do you, yeah, what are your thoughts on both those things that I just said?
That's the great. And I think when it comes to person of color, it depends on the privilege that that person of color has had.
Right.
Because with me and coming from the background that I came from, a small town in the South, and even when we moved to a larger city when I was 10, like an hour away, we still went back every single month. So I always had to go
Mhm.
back and forth in between those spots. So I never really left, I like to say. And so
Right.
when I think about it from that point, it's like I think about it where so this is where we have to bring class into this because I
Sure.
think that is where you can still, and people have actually talked about this in anthropology, where
Mhm.
actually sometimes where when it is a person of color doing that work, but they are from a different class background, it actually can cause
Yeah.
those groups to actually shut down and actually want to talk to a white, researcher more in that way.
Interesting.
And so, that's why one of my mentors, when she wrote that piece on this, she's amazing, where she talked about the fact that your membership card is not taken for granted at that point. Like you actually still have to prove that along.
Mm.
And so, the fact that I think about that, where, people may see me, they're like, oh, he's another black person like me in some cases. But what they also look at is they're like, oh, well, how does he talk? How does he
Yeah.
dress and all of those things? And it's like, oh, he may be nothing like me at all except for skin color. I mean, we have that funny joke, skin folk, but not
Mm.
kin folk. And so that's
Right.
where I'm like, sometimes it works and sometimes it does not, and it's still a question of competency at that point because really what they're looking at is also. I kind of make a joke about this, but it's sort of true. Are you going to really represent and advocate for my voice, or are you actually just working for the quote unquote establishment, and you're just a
Right.
tool in the process to get things from me, and I'm not going to benefit from this research at all, and you
Yeah.
are going to get that, and so it really is about sort of letting them know where I stand on research as a person of color, so that
Yeah.
I think that builds that trust that it's like I know what I'm doing. I'm not just like
Yeah.
fooling around, but at the same time, I also want to make sure that you, as a participant, are protected because I know the historical cases when people of color in this country, when it comes to research, have not been, protected. And it's very
Yeah.
easy for us to go back into those slippery slopes again when we have especially untrained people doing research
Yeah.
in industry. And so that is why I tend to be a little bit more cautious on that point. And I think that when they hear how cautious, so that I am, that I also take the time to explain to them what will happen once the session is done with their data, because I don't think that very many people do that anymore.
Yeah,
It
they
lets
don't.
them know that throughout the entire life cycle, even long after our call is done or our time,
Hmm.
in the field is done, I'm still looking out for you, even
Yeah.
we are no longer, together. And I always let
Yeah.
them know that, like, at the end of the day, if you recall, even 6 months later, I don't care, even a year, that you said something and you're like, I don't want this used, I always tell them you have
Hmm.
every right, and I will respond to this, to tell me, Nate, I do not want this used. And I will go back into that transcript and I will take that part out.
Really?
Always let them
Wow.
do that, because that's how we're trained, in anthropology, where we're like, right,
Yeah.
that people always have the right to come back and tell you those things, because they invite us, just like the same thing with the UXR space. They invite us into our lives. All right,
Hmm.
they invite us into their lives, and we are a
Yeah.
guest. We are not. They don't have to talk to us. So it is a
Yeah.
privilege to be able, to talk to them. And I never
Yeah.
forget that. So that's why I treat it in that way, is I'm like, yes, it does help them feel comfortable, but I always let them know that
Yeah.
they, as the researched, have the
Hmm.
power in this process. That I don't have all the power, that they have power. And I try to always remind them of that.
It's just, I love what you're saying because it just feels so much more humanizing than a lot of sometimes I see research and I want to bluntly tell folks, you're not talking to lab rats. Also, you should respect lab rats too. You're
Mhm.
talking to people who are living, breathing, and are bringing in and making themselves vulnerable to you. So I really appreciate what you said. That said, so far we've talked about how your upbringing and your experience, and we've talked about how your personal identity as a person of color, as someone who grew up in the South, as someone who had a parent who was a who continues to be a huge influence in their life, how that has influenced how you work and sort of your career journey you've taken so far. I want to know if, especially in the world we're living in right now,
Mhm.
have global movements and the shifts and conversations, especially right now around equality and gender and race and all of these things, have they played any part in influencing the way you approach not only research but also how you collaborate as a professional with the personal identity that you have?
You know what's interesting about that question? Because it's interesting how it's framed, where we think about everything going on right now, and I kind of think about this as an anthropologist, where it's interesting for UXR. I think that these conversations are new. In anthropology, these conversations are actually we had to deal
Hmm.
with a lot of that stuff when decolonization first hit in the '60s, and
Right.
and then even beyond that, like, the things that we're still grappling with to this day.
Yeah.
A lot of it had to do with the politics of representation, and how we had to think about even how even how we represent people. I remember there was
Hmm.
even a thing where we changed. We used to call them informants, and then we
Hmm.
changed that to participants. And
Hmm.
there was a lot of things that changed in regards to how we would think about people as human beings. And so
Right.
I like to say that, like, UXR may be going through a lot of these things right now, but I think that when you deal
Yeah.
with those issues and those debates, both on an academic side and also
Yeah.
on the industry side too, I feel like that's what I brought into the industry space. Um,
Got it.
because I feel like when you've had those discussions for so long, you kind of know where people are going to go and where they're going to try to get themselves into a corner and what they're going to use to back out of.
Hmm.
So I feel that anthropology really prepared me well for that, because because like everything that we're talking about now, I was like, anthropologists of color who did certain kinds of work, like the people that I used to hang with, we faced that a long time ago, where it was this notion of first going from like, well, your work is not really valued unless you do something
Hmm.
like this. And then it became, oh, this is sexy now because it's, multidisciplinary and everything else.
Right.
Now we're kind of on that fence again now where people are like, well, this
Yeah.
EI stuff is a little bit dangerous for right now. And
Yeah.
so it's interesting in terms of like, but I actually will say something about what's different now. I do believe that UXR is interesting because one of the things that I see is that a lot of the conversations around difference for the longest time, this is one thing that used to sort of trouble me about the UXR space, were influenced primarily by psychological and cognitive notions around race and race, gender, and everything else. There was not much room for other disciplines like anthropology, sociology, gender studies, in the fields of gender and and sexuality studies, studies, psychology and cognitive science. And it's actually strange because anthropology had a huge part in HCI when it was first being formed, but that history kind of got written out at a certain point. But
Right.
they rely on a lot of those notions from psychology and cognitive science. And also, I will say that they rely on those from a sort of non post-colonial theory framework as well too, because a lot of people who were trained in that part have actually gone back and looked at the way that fields like psychology and cog sci and anthropology
Hmm.
were very much a part of the colonizing project. And so
True.
they haven't brought that part in. And so I do feel like that's one
Yeah.
thing that, and I actually talk about this in one of the pieces that I, put online, is that I feel like if we're going to meet this moment in the way that I
Hmm.
think that we should, we need to, thank you for letting me talk about this. We need to get
Of
away
course.
from this crude distinction, I feel, of
Hmm.
qual versus quant, researchers. And we actually need to think
Mm.
about the disciplines that they come from because you get different kinds of insights at that point. Because a psychology researcher and I may both be qual, but we make very different assumptions around people, interaction, society, the ethics. We even define culture differently. And so
Yeah.
for me, I feel like if we're going to meet this moment and really do the work that needs to be done with DEI, I think that this is where we have to have a multidisciplinary conversation and not a multi-method conversation. Because to me, I just like to think
Mm.
that the methods are just the way that you collect the data, but
Yeah.
the discipline is actually the perspective that informs how you look at even how you ask
Yeah.
the question itself and even what you're going to look for and look at. So I've actually been thinking that we should be building research teams now around different disciplines as opposed to different qual versus quant. Um, to
That's
really,
super interesting. I want to dig into that a little bit
yeah.
deeper because what I really love about everything that you said, and right now this is why I love talking to you because you literally answered my next question already. Because my question was going to be about professional challenges as well as breakthroughs that are attached to all of your identity and experience, and you've had both. You've clearly had both. But what I want to dig into is that given the you've clearly faced challenges, but you've also had several breakthroughs given your unique perspective and identity. When you say we should be forming more around disciplines, dig into that for me. Tell me more.
Well, for instance, and so and it's an interesting conversation because we have a lot of people in UXR who actually got trained on the job, and so
Right.
that happens. And at the same time, what I've also and I will go back to Google when I worked there. They were really good at this actually, where they actually were able to create an environment for researchers where I call them mixed levels of education cohorts, where you could have PhDs working side by side with people who did not have that, but they were able, when they had enough people from different disciplines,
Hmm.
those same people who were not trained formally in a like say like in a discipline could
Yeah.
actually get that same learning from multiple people, and
Right.
so it actually spread out in that way. And so when people are like, Nate, should you hire PhDs and that's it? It's like, nah, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is I encourage people to use the disciplines that they come from. I actually ask people about this now, in interviews. I actually ask them like, hey, I noticed that your background is in city planning. How does that
Hmm.
inform the way that you think about people, think about interactions and things around that?
Hmm.
Because what I don't want people to do, and I know that people have been encouraged to do this, and I disagree with this a lot. They've been
Hmm.
encouraged to check their backgrounds at the door when they don't come from
Yeah.
a psychology background or cognitive science background.
Yeah.
And you are sort of implicitly encouraged to, what I kind of joke about, psychologize your insights at that point. Because the classic question that UXR people or that other people often have is, what do people think? And I say, psychologists may not mind answering that question for you. Some of them do,
Yeah.
some of them don't. But I say, as an anthropologist, I don't know what people think. I was like, because I can
Yeah.
tell you that a lot of our data comes down to what people say. And I'm like, and this is where my background as a person of color in anthropology, and I bring this up to folks a lot. We know for
Yeah.
a fact that participants lie for a variety of reasons, and it some and like and a lot
Yeah.
of times that has to do with being safe. And so some groups know what answer to give certain people to get them off of their backs. And so,
Yeah.
and if
It's
you
like the comment you make to your parents, right? If you don't want them
Mhm.
to know something.
Exactly. And it's kind of
Yeah.
like that's sort of the way that I saw when research was done amongst people of color too, in places, so that I'm from, is that whenever a researcher would come around, they'd be like, oh, they probably work, so for the government, so don't tell them
Yeah.
too much. And so when you have people from disciplines that have dealt with that over time in the same way, they bring a different nuance in how to actually design studies. Because
Hmm.
like if you come from anthropology or even from sociology too, you kind of anticipate that people will lie to you. And so you
Sure.
actually find ways to work around that. And you know that they'll lie to
Yeah.
you because they're not comfortable with you yet. And so, because I don't know what they're thinking, I'm like,
Yeah.
I have to trust things a little bit. And so,
Huh.
when you bring in people from those other disciplines who've dealt with those kinds of problems, and even when they've dealt with the issues of representation, like for instance, the pseudonym thing, that's still being talked about in anthropology today. And it actually is different than how than how some like my other colleagues will, name participants P1 and P2. And I was
Right.
like, as an anthropologist, I have never been allowed to do that because we're like, you have to name them as a human being, not
Human.
as a
Yeah.
piece of data, or like not as some kind of, of point of,
Robot, really.
and
Just not as a
so
data point.
that's why I'm like, when you have people from different disciplines,
Yeah.
they bring not only just a different level of insights, but they also bring a different perspective on methodological choices in a way that I
Yeah.
think is going to get us closer to solving more wicked problems than
Yeah.
building. Like, I always think it's strange within job advertisements in the field where we list all these different disciplines like they're interchangeable, and yet we
Yeah.
spend the most time refining the methodologies. And I've often
Hmm.
joked that I'm like, the same two disciplines can do the same methodologies, but the way that they will give you the insights, or even what the insights are very
Yeah.
different. That's why I say there are psychological insights, there are anthropological insights, there are
Yeah.
sociological ones. And I do believe that a company or an organization that is, to use the phrase, mature, uh,
Hmm.
is comfortable with handling the tensions in between those different disciplines. The ones that
Right.
I find are still struggling with research in many cases don't they see that as noise that they don't want to handle.
So I mean, again, so many gems in there, but I'm really interested in. So, you give some really good advice here, right? Because, and it's making me think about this conversation I was having with a researcher on one of my current teams, a really smart woman, where a question was posed to her, where it was somewhere around the lines of, well, what do people want here? And her response was exactly, well, I can't tell you what people want, but I can give you the context they have when I speak with them. And I find that your advice here on, like, hey, I can give you the data, I can give you the surrounding, this is how they were feeling, this was the setup and all of that. And that's such solid advice, especially for UX researchers and anthropologists out there, to like, all of this context matters, because at the end of the day, in the product world, you take that info and then you're making a bet, right? To say
Mhm.
that, oh, the research told me this and then the research was wrong. No, the research gave you data points to take a bet. And I think that's often lost in what you were talking about, mature companies versus not mature companies. And I wish more people would take that context, right? Like the research and give you data points. And then again, you're making a bet. It's not 100% that you're going to hit a bullseye.
Mhm.
Sometimes you do, right? But you're just trying to make more informed decisions with all of that. Um,
That's where my academic background comes back into play as well too, because this has
huh.
to do with the first job that I took when I left the the academic space. I was in a consulting firm. It was a design thinking firm.
Hmm.
The entire research team by design was anthropologist, and so
Right.
that for me was one of the places that I sort of like. I felt proud to have my my anthropology card. Because when I left that firm and went into tech, I found that that card was controversial. But it made me really see something, which has to do with when. Yeah, I'm just trying to think about how to phrase this. It's like when people, I just feel like one of the things that goes down. I'm losing my train of thought here on this because you said something really important on this point, and now I'm blanking. That happens to me. So
No
I'm
worries,
sure
because
it'll
it's like this.
come back to me at some
It
point.
will come back. Don't even worry about it. But on the on the note of advice, because I don't want to lose the thread completely. Um, I guess like when you're thinking about someone entering this field for the first time,
Hmm?
whether it's from anthropology or whether it's from product management, whether it's from like, hey, I'm just doing a complete career change. I was a
Hmm?
musician and now I love research or whatever. What advice would you give to someone entering this field of UX research for the first time? And especially for someone from a historically underrepresented
Hmm?
background in our country, would that advice be any different?
It would.
Hmm. Okay.
So for someone coming into the field for the first time, and I always make a distinction between people coming from an academic space into this field and people who are not. The ones coming from from an academic space, I would tell them be proud of your discipline. And honor that disciplinary card that you have, because one of the things that you will find is that a lot of people, that was where I was going at this point, a lot of people will just think that the observations are the insights. As an
Mm.
academic, you know that the observations just form that first layer. And then you've got to go back to the theories and concepts that you know that are changing all of the time. And that will help you to inform and explain why you're seeing what you're seeing. Because the data doesn't entirely tell you, the whole story. And you also have access to researchers who are still, in the academic space who actually hopefully still like you. And they can get you access to work that you can also cite alongside that too. And you can play the role of translator at that point. And I would also tell
Mm.
you, don't be afraid to learn from other disciplines too. To take that multidisciplinary mindset and to also not entirely look down on someone because they do not have a degree, but they are but they are a researcher in the field. Because actually, there are some things, kind of like the anthropology thing, where we're like, you can learn from anybody. And so to sort of check that part at the door, but also know that you might hear things that you may find strange. Trust your
Mm.
gut on that, and use
Yeah.
that to say, I don't agree with that, and I can tell you why. And here's another way that we could do it. For those without an academic background, I would say, um, there are books out there that one can read about the field, but I also encourage people to think about what discipline or classes that you took in college that you really liked. That's probably the discipline that you feel the most at home with. And so think
Yeah,
about how you would look at the same kind of thing, but through that disciplinary like insight there. Because I do think that
that's so smart.
observational skills with your discipline
Yeah.
let you make stronger, design recommendations. And for those who are people of color and, in any route, I always tell people who, especially who are going into tech, how do I say this nicely? Depending on
Just be blunt.
where you are,
Yeah.
it is not only a possibility, but more in actuality in some cases that you will be
Uh-huh.
seen as a source of intimidation
Hmm.
because of the fact that you come into the room with a presence that people will know and they will look at. And UXR is a really tough field in that regard because we often have to say things that people do not want to hear but need to hear.
Yeah.
And depending on who you are, whether this be gender, or ethnicity, or race, or sexuality, or all of the above, um, the words from your mouth can be taken in a very different way than someone else. And so, being able to understand that just because people may not take what you say in a certain way, it does not
Hmm.
mean that you were wrong. And to not second guess yourself, because you don't look like what popular culture thinks an expert ought to look like. And
Yeah.
so it's one of those things where you have to get people used to prolonged exposure of you for them to sort of get over their prejudices and their discriminations, which I do believe personally in tech still exist. It's just more
Mhm.
structural now than interpersonal.
Yeah. I completely agree with you, and I appreciate you phrasing all of that and bringing it together so eloquently because it's true. It absolutely does exist, and then sometimes it can blindside you if you don't expect it. Right. Um, we're coming up towards the end, unfortunately, and I still have so many questions. I'm going to throw in a couple more if you'll be patient with me.
Sure. And we can do a part two if
Towards,
you ever want to as well, because I'm
oh,
always here.
you know I want to, Nate, absolutely. But that said, I have to ask the question. All with all of the AI and the agentic this and all of that, you and I've been also talking and texting a lot about how the field is evolving and changing and what influences AI have. When it comes to research, what do you think people should be aware of for
Mhm.
AI, as well as how how do you feel that it's reshaping the space?
That is a two-pronged question. It's
Yep.
actually on two different tracks. So track one. So I'll take
Yes.
track one first and then track two.
Okay.
Track
Okay.
one is the fact that UXRs now, because of the pressures in tech overall, are
Yeah.
actually now, it's almost a requirement now that you know about AI, both from the technical parts of it and also from the UX parts of it too. It is in part because there's a lot of pressure for companies to put AI in some shape or form into their products. And so it's
Yeah.
actually become, I think, a part of our skill set if we are going to survive as a discipline to actually take courses. And I've had to do that, on my own. I've had to take courses
Same.
that actually brought me into a network of folks who I never would have thought I would have ever talked to. And it's also been a way
Nice.
to change my mind about certain parts of AI as well, too, and discover new frameworks on ethics out there that I've been able to bring to folks, in a variety of spaces. And they love hearing the anthropological take that I have on ethics because we have our own ethical code. And I'm like, well, how does this compare with the code that we have over here around this? And so that's actually
Huh.
informed the way that I approach AI as a potential solution is actually
Yeah.
through the code of ethics from anthropology. It's like a
Interesting.
combination of do no harm and then also do
Yeah.
some good. And it's got us to think a lot about, well, what does good mean in this space, and good for who, and the multiple people who are involved in that. And so I do
Yeah.
think that's where UX researchers play a huge part in this, because our job is to always make sure that AI or not, whatever is put out there is safe, it is usable, it does something that's net good over net harm. And then
Hmm.
also it's ethical the way that we not only got the data, but also built it. Because AI does ask for a lot of trust from people to
Yeah.
give over data at that point, and that it won't be used in a way that is, not so great. And so it
Yeah.
really has pushed, I think, a lot of us, and myself especially, to think back about those ethical parts about the field. I think that, and people will probably hate me for saying this, I do think that the UXPA code of ethics does not go far enough in this, and I think that they're going to have to do some, revising on this. That's why I actually use both the UXPA code and the code of ethics from anthropology, both in my work, because I feel like one doesn't
Interesting.
go as far as I would like it to really, protect people in some really key ways. And I encourage that with folks a lot. The other
Do
part,
you wish, before we get to the
yeah,
second prong, do you wish more people would at least learn about anthropology so that they can come in? Because you look at everything so holistically, and even for your code of ethics, you're informing yourself from multiple ways. Do you wish more researchers did that? And more,
I,
frankly,
I
tech
do.
folks did that.
I actually, if I could redesign a lot of programs that people come from for HCI and everything else, I would encourage that anthropology courses be a part of the curriculum,
Hmm.
especially
Yeah.
courses on things like globalization, because we design tech in a global capitalistic framework now. It is
Yeah.
not in a localized, provincial way. And I think that's actually where we struggle as a discipline with UXR, where the notions of globalization tend to be very simplistic a lot of times.
Yeah.
And I do think that training from other different fields, and I would also say the same for gender and sexuality studies too, that I think
Yeah.
those courses ought to be a part of those curriculums too, because those fields have been, I call them the troublemaker fields, where they have been the ones that have actually unsettled a lot of things that people have thought from a
Yeah.
Eurocentric way. And I do believe that that knowledge needs to be brought into those kind of programs to actually get more to
Yeah.
actually tackle the problems that we're all facing on really inclusive design. That's why I think that the field has not
Yeah.
come far enough on that, because we're trying to do it with a discipline that doesn't allow you to really get at the political and social dimensions of these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's just so much of academia generally. I love your comments about how we've thought about things from a Eurocentric way for so long, but they also continue to be taught that way. And that
Hmm.
holistic approach, you're right, actually. No matter what you get into, the study of anthropology just makes you look at the world in such a different way. I mean, personally, just whenever I come at something, I'm thinking about um, 2 year studies in social sciences, and like I draw so much of that even in my day-to-day work and living and as a parent and as a human. Um, I i agree with you that that would make your I just also make your education so much more richer.
Hmm. I do believe that that is one of the things, and I would even encourage, if I would, I was like, this is why engineers also need these courses too.
Yes.
Because what I find is that when they have that background, I don't. It's actually quite amazing when when I sort of like train them how to ask these kinds of questions. They'll actually ask them for me in calls like with the entire team, and I'm like, "Well, my job is done today," because they're actually doing it now, And well, they'll say,
Yeah.
"Well, we don't want to assume this," and I'm like, "Yes, it's working." And so, that's where I think that really all of product teams, I think, and engineering teams. So that's why what I'll constantly do is I'll post up things in our in our team Slack. I'll be like, hey, I'm reading this book or I'm reading this book. Will they read it? Who knows? But do they know about
Yeah.
it now? Yes, and that is what's important.
Nice. I've started, whenever I suggest books, I've started giving the chat GPT summary so that you'll at least have those highlights.
Mhm.
Okay, two more questions. I know
Oh
we'll get
wait,
to
but let me
prong
go to the
two.
second prong for you.
Yeah, so I said, let's go to prong two, and then I have just two more questions for you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Second
Thank you
prong
for
is
being so
really
generous.
no problem. So second prong is really simple. Well, it's simple in Nate terms. That's good. And this is one thing that's actually being discussed in the UXR field a lot, which is the use of AI tools in the UXR space. It's a very controversial topic
Hmm,
because there is a fear from some people, sort of like what teachers think about this, that like this can put us out on like this can actually take our jobs away because they're like, oh, well, if the AI can summarize I mean, I've seen things put out there now, like you can have an AI to moderate sessions. I kind of have thoughts about that. You can have an AI to synthesize data and everything else and all of that. I got thoughts about that too. And
yeah.
while it democratizes to a degree some of these things, I often say that one thing that my courses in AI have really taught me is that the output is only as good as the input. Which to me, I take the human in the loop approach, which is that it's only as good as the human and what they know that inputs things
Right.
into the model that then does this. So I usually am a little bit more distrustful of like pre-configured, things, in AI for the UXR field, because I'm like we're all trained in different ways and we all come at it with different assumptions.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to make something that is customizable or that is a one size fit all. So I do think that this is something that we are going to have to think about as a field a lot more because it does introduce some ethical questions into this too, around even things with
Mhm.
data storage and data privacy at that point, around the fact that when you put people's personal information, because this stuff hasn't been sanitized yet, into these
Right.
kinds of things, do you also open up that chance for if the data leak happens, that can be released out there too?
Right.
Compared to the older ways where we actually kept those things in servers in house on purpose. And so I think there's a lot that we are going to have to work out. Even, I'll just say this other thing too. It's like when it comes to what the AI actually does, the thing that makes an academic researcher a little bit different is that we don't just summarize the observations, we're also drawing on the theories and concepts that we know. The AI doesn't know those things. It's just
Yeah.
only going off the observations that are there. So it just repackages a lot of times what people told you, but it doesn't get down
Yeah.
to the deeper why. And so for me, that's
Yeah.
where I'm like, we have a lot to think about in terms of if we take the human in the loop, approach to AI, we got to think about, well, what human practices or praxis is a part of that process,
Yeah.
versus just
Yeah.
applying
That's so
human.
true, right? Because I feel like yes, AI is helpful, but I personally believe, and I think that's what you're saying as well, that you still need a human attached to it. Apart from the ethical and like the data legal, yes, 100% to all of that, but I think you also just need someone to, because like AI can still make stuff up. It can also take
It
research
can.
in a direction that doesn't make any sense for your work. I do genuinely believe that yes, it speeds that up speeds stuff up, and yes, you have to get with it because that's where the world is going, but you do need a human attached to all of this. I completely agree with you there.
And a human who was present when those things happened.
Yes.
Because the thing is that the AI, there's certain contextual information that the AI may not know. For instance, we get to see the screener with all the information about that person.
Yeah.
So we can figure out why certain things might have been said. The AI doesn't have that information. And so
Yeah.
this is where the human is really important in this process. And I'll say a trained human, I'll have to say, because the fact that
Right.
I think the promise with a lot of this new stuff is that anybody can do research, and I've always cringed at that thought. I believe that anybody can ask a question, but not every question is a research question. And
Yeah.
I feel like that is where some of my concerns are, where it comes to the democratization of the UXR practice when it comes to these kinds of tools. I don't think as a discipline we're fully there yet, and in many orgs we're not. I
Mm,
think,
no.
and I think that the promise of AI can make people believe that we are at that place yet, and we're actually not. And that's one thing that I'm sort of keeping
Yeah.
a pulse on.
Um, yeah, I'm just digesting over here. All right. I want to be mindful of your time. Two last questions.
Go
What do
ahead.
you what are you reading right now?
I'm reading a lot of things. I'll actually show you one that I'm reading right now. Let me see if yeah, it's right here. It's a classic in economic anthropology because of where I work. Gifts and
Ah,
Commodities. And I read this book because basically it is, I think that when people work in the nonprofit space where donations are a key thing, they often make the mistake in thinking that the commodity, economy and the gift economy work the same way, and they actually don't. And so for
mm,
me, I've been reading this book again and again and again because it's a reminder for me around when you work in the commodity space, which is usually for most of us the for-profit space, and we come into a nonprofit space, why you have to check some of that thinking, because when people are not buying anything but they're giving, um,
yeah.
different assumptions have to be made. So I'm reading that, and I'm also reading a book on humans in the loop when it comes to AI by Robert Monroe. Um, yeah, because I just went to a talk that he gave the other day, and I'm looking at that now to think about, okay, well, like anthropology is the study of the human, condition. So human is a word that we love a lot, and
Right.
reading it to see how is human being defined and also not defined, because that's actually one funny thing in anthropology. We will debate. We've been doing this for decades now, actually even longer, on what is a human. But other fields seem to take
Hmm.
it as a granted thing that they know what a human is. And we're like, but actually, different cultures define a human in different ways. And
Yeah.
so I've been reading that book to think about, well, what
Okay.
exactly is a human in the AI framework now? And how can anthropology sort of complicate that discussion a little bit in a nice way?
I'll have to check it out. That sounds really interesting. All right. Last question, I promise.
I got
Um,
it.
what's on your mind today?
Oh, what's on my mind today? I would say the precariousness of UXR right now in the
Hmm.
industry. Because unfortunately, right now, there is a greater push to launch things much faster. And I think because of that push, I believe that some places believe themselves to be user centric, but
Hmm.
they're really launch centric,
Yeah.
and they talk about users. But there's a difference in between talking about users and building user centrically. And I worry about that in the field, because I think that as we want to go faster and faster, I
Hmm.
believe that what's happened, unfortunately, and I really miss these days, is that there has been less of an appetite for foundational discovery pathfinding work. It has become more. We already know what we should build, so we'll just build it and validate it. And
Yeah.
I miss those days where this is kind of a sad thing. I miss those days when, for how good or bad it was, when design thinking was all the rage, because it really did stop people from building too fast, and it
Yeah.
got them to actually try to understand who people are, what their ecosystems are, and what they're going through, and what are they doing. And so those are the
Yeah.
things that are on my mind is sort of like in this state that we're in, what is the new identity that UXR needs to form, which I've talked about in different places, but I think about that today in terms of, the problems that we're seeing with, the layoffs with UXR being hit hard, like in many places too, and it's being seen now as like more of it's almost like it's being seen as like a hat you can put on or take off, but you still, but everything else is more important. I kind of feel like it's not a hat, it's your actual arm. Or put it this way, it is your brain and your heart that
Yeah.
is what the research field is. And I just worry
Yeah.
that we're trying to be more robotic and think less about the emotions that people go through when they use products to launch things fast. So that's what's been on my mind a lot.
Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciated everything you talked about. Also, now you know what we're talking about next, right? It's
What
design think what is design thinking in the world of AI? I feel like we should team up and do a whole talk because I have thoughts, Nate. I have thoughts, but
that
that's
can
I'm
be
gonna
that can
right.
be
I
a
feel like
panel.
that has to be yeah, that could totally be a panel because you're right. Like, what is design thinking? Because I do genuinely value it, but I won't even go down there because
It's
that's
one of
going to
those
be our
things that
next discussion. A hundred
yeah,
percent.
it's something that I know that the designers who I used to know who were involved in that they had a love hate relationship, towards it because they like, oh, it's
Yeah.
great because it put design on the forefront. It was also not so great because everybody's a designer now, which is one of the things that some of the extreme people used to take that view. And it's kind of the same feelings so that I have with researchers. Like if it was talked
Hmm.
about in that thing too, where everybody is a researcher, and I was like, no, you're not.
Like,
And
yeah,
so
no,
it's one of those,
there's
yeah,
so much to it, right? There's so much to the field. All right, we already have our part two
yes.
planned, but maybe I like the idea of doing it as a panel. But
If
on
you
that
would like
note,
to, I've got guests for you. I
ah,
have tons of folks who love to talk about this.
okay, let's make this happen. I think it could be really fun.
Great.
Oh, well, thank you. This has been such an honor.
Thank you. Always good to talk to you, Maria.
Thanks for listening to the UX Ladder Conversations Beyond Pixels, created by Mariam Khan, music by Ben Ewing.